of global geographic reports, benchmark reports that we've put together with IFMA, and we're excited to present the latest results from this recent study. So today's agenda, we're going to spend a few minutes talking about the benchmarking process and what's involved with that. We'll talk about the facility demographics, and then we'll highlight some of the janitorial maintenance costs associated with that. And of course, we'll have time at the end for questions and answers. Of course, if you do have questions throughout the presentation, be sure to highlight that or type that into the chat box or on LinkedIn or wherever you might be viewing this from, and we will certainly address that as we go throughout the presentations. And I see several of you checking in already. Wonderful. Great to have you all here. Okay, so the first thing we want to talk about here is why do we benchmark? What is the intent of this, and what are we trying to get out of this? The intent of benchmarking is so that as a facilities professional, you can look at how your facility operates and compare that to other similar types of facilities. We're trying to get good quality information to help us make better business decisions, right? The other thing we're thinking about too here is to help us answer the challenges of why we're asking for different costs. If you have a facility upgrade you're looking to enhance, if you're looking to bring on additional staff or some other change that you think would be worth it for your facility, benchmarking done effectively can help you actually make that business case successful. Now, when we think about a little bit about our group, we are Simplar. We are a group of researchers and educators. As was mentioned, I'm at the University of North Carolina in Charlotte. I also partner with other universities. And our main focus to help clients, owners, vendors, whoever, become clients of choice. And again, we were thankful and excited to participate on this particular project. Okay, let's do a very brief history lesson as to how we got started here. So IFMA for a number of years has done significant benchmarking. Primarily it started in North America. Now this says 2017. That's when our team got involved. Before that, there has been, goodness, probably 20 or 30 years before that where they've continued to do different benchmarking reports. So 2017, we published the North American O&M benchmarking report. And the reason why that's relevant here, because that has branched out into numerous other reports just due to the very high level of participation. 2018, we published a qualitative operations maintenance report. In fact, these two reports have been recently updated or in the process of being updated, so be sure to check that out. Again, that has a North American focus. 2020, we did a global space planning report and benchmarking. Now, it's interesting that when we conducted this survey and this report, the data we collected was honestly about 3 weeks before most of the world shut down due to COVID. So in terms of you're trying to find a really good baseline or comparison as to how things used to be before COVID, this report, from everything I've seen, is probably one of the most relevant that has that. Also, heads up, we're currently updating that report too, and we'll see how things have shifted globally as a result of the coronavirus. So be sure to check that out. That'll be coming out in the next few months. We also, in 2021, we conducted a global salary compensation report that focused on pay, benefits, other ancillary benefits to facility professionals. Again, that's throughout the world, and was quite a comprehensive report. And then lastly, we have the Asia Operation Maintenance Benchmark Report. Now, why in the world are we bringing all this up here? My intent is to show that IFMA has embarked on, as it continues to progress down, a global benchmarking effort to look at various needs and geographic regions throughout the world to provide you as facility professionals access to the most recent and relevant data that is available. So my last comment about benchmarking, how this came about here, is to think about how do you benchmark or how do you actually get started here. Well, what this represents is the typical benchmarking process. You start with defining what are we actually benchmarking. You collect that data, you evaluate and compare that data to what other else you might be looking at. You take action, and finally you repeat, and you do this as a cyclical process. Now, what I have found, and again, this is a pretty important point here, folks, is that as you yourself continue and embark on this benchmarking journey, is that a lot of folks get access to the report or to the data. They're excited to have access to it, but nothing else ever happens. So I encourage you that as you access this report, start looking at the data, be sure to develop a specific strategy and plan that can help you go forward and make changes based on the types of data that you're collecting. So be sure to keep that in mind here as you think about it. Actually take the data and do something with it. Okay, so how do we actually develop this particular report? We review questions from North America and also the Asia owner reports. We've also done a couple other reports in Europe. Of course, the space planning and the salary reports, those are all benchmarking type reports. So we kind of reviewed those and developed the Middle East report. We had a group of subject matter experts who also provided commentary and recommendations on the overall survey structure. So we used their comments. The survey was sent to both IFMA and non-IFMA members. There was no requirement to be one or the other. So we did send it to everybody we could possibly get a hold of. And we had respondents from these 8 countries in terms of who that represents. Now, as you're going to see here, as we present the data throughout the survey, they are presented in reales. So you can always convert that to your own local currency, but based on the predominant number of respondents from Saudi Arabia, that's how we calculated the cost here. These costs are based on cost per square meter. So everything you're going to see is reales per square meter throughout the report. So please keep that in mind. And we had about 70 detailed responses throughout the survey. As I mentioned, everything is converted into reales. Now, in terms of industry sector, this provides a breakdown of the different sectors that are provided for this. And on the right-hand side is the description of the facility. So what does it do? Is it a single building, so just an FM by themselves managing a single building, or is a campus or a group of buildings that would be beneficial here? Now, one thing I want to talk about here is that this particular report in the Middle East, just like our Asia report, is the very first time we're collecting benchmarking data like this from an IFMA standpoint. So as we keep in mind here, globally, the objective is to continue developing and enhancing the number of responses and the quality and overall types of data that we use throughout here. So if you find yourself having value out of this report or you think there's benefit in it, be sure to participate in other studies as we had this come up here, right? So this is the first of its kind, so keep that in mind as we look at the total number of responses. The next thing we looked at is what are the average age of the facilities? So right now what I'm talking about is just the demographics of the buildings. We're going to move into the operational data here in a moment, but I want to talk about the types of data that we're seeing. So in terms of facility age, most of the facilities in this particular data set are less than 10 years old. About half the respondents reported on buildings that were actually quite new. When you compare this to North America, for example, which has a very large data set, most of the buildings fall into these 2 categories here, 31 to 40 years old or about 41 to 50 years old. I'd say about 60% of all the buildings for North America were about here. For Asia, most of the buildings, kind of like the Middle East, tend to fall in this category over here. Now, when you look at when we had a pilot, or I should say a white paper study from Europe, most of those buildings were also tend to be on the older side. Okay, so why is that relevant to you? Well, if you have a bunch of data about newer facilities, they will tend to at least operate a little bit more efficiently. And then as components age and we have to replace them, that'll obviously affect how we look at different things. So just keep that in mind. Most of the data are from fairly new buildings as we look at this. We asked respondents to provide us some background about, based on the type of building they're looking at, is it leased, do you own it and lease it to others, or do you own and occupy them? What we find here is that if you look at the overall trends is that as we move from a single space within a building down to multiple buildings and multiple locations, what we see here is that people tend to own, this light blue here on the right-hand side, they tend to own and occupy their own buildings as they have larger and more spacious facilities. Makes sense. They tend to own and operate their own buildings. Right? In terms of the square meters per occupant, now this one is a little bit of a challenge to understand here, right? Because when you think about occupants, or excuse me, size per occupant, how much space is allocated per person in the facility, that has been dramatically affected by COVID, as we all know, right? So if you have a facility that is, let's say, 100,000 square meters, and everybody goes home, and there's only a couple people left, obviously the allocations per occupant in that building will be significantly higher because there's fewer people here. So just keep that in mind here. What we found here is that on average, so for example, for educational facilities, the average square meters per occupant was about 71 meters per occupant. Right, office spaces about 57. Those other types of facility uses were significantly higher. Again, this has everything inside of there, so warehouses, office buildings, labs, things like that. That's kind of where this came from. And what we've seen here is that on average, overall, the space allocations for the Middle East are about 20% more than North America. So it's kind of interesting how these things have come about. But again, it's just differences in how space is allocated. Now, one sidebar comment I just want to make about this is that you see that a lot of the data here is compared to North America. And why am I doing that? Again, it's not because of a complex or anything like that. The reason why we're comparing to North America is because that's the largest data set we have available. There are literally thousands of buildings. There's about 50,000 buildings that we have in our data set. So when we look for a comparison point, that's the closest thing we have from a data quality standpoint. So again, just keep in mind, that's why we're referencing that as we take a look at this particular data. And Ashley, hopefully y'all can still hear me. If not, just let me know about that. Now, one of the things here that as we go throughout this presentation, keep in mind here is that space management is something we have to think about on a regular basis. So again, I encourage you all and maybe we can have a short, brief interactive discussion here, but what types of space management challenges do you see in your facility, right? What best practices have you seen? I encourage you all to take a moment here and type into the chat box, what have you learned from a space management standpoint that has made your operating of the facility a lot easier? Anybody have any thoughts or perspectives about that? I'm just kind of going through the comments right now here, folks. And we've got a number of folks here participating. That's awesome. Any recommendations or thoughts about how you manage space in your facility? Give us a few more seconds and then we'll move on here. Okay. Well, we'll keep going here, folks. Again, I encourage you to, if you have other ideas, to be sure to drop in the chat box to have a conversation, and let's build on what we're talking about here. Okay, let's move into the actual operations and maintenance data of our facilities. One of the first things we asked respondents here was, how do you manage your buildings from a sustainability standpoint, right? So in terms of green certification, we asked respondents, how does your facility maintain that, right? Well, one of the things we've seen here is that we asked respondents 4 questions. Does your facility have any green elements? Now, green meaning, is it certified by some sort of standard, green globes or other standards out there? So is there any type of certification? Do you have plans for certification? You don't have it today, but you have plans in the future. You have green elements, but no certification. So you've actually taken on green initiatives, although you're not certified. Or finally, you actually have buildings that are certified here, right? And I've seen lots of comments coming about the last question about space management, common spaces, dedicated spaces, storage. Absolutely, really good comments here about we're seeing that, right? Thank you, Carla. Thank you, Bunkia. Appreciate that. So think about this from a green certification standpoint. This is something that we've kind of kept an eye on throughout the data as we're seeing this here, right? So when you look at this and compare this to a global comparison compared to the Middle East to other sectors, we see that the green, relatively speaking, is a little bit lower compared to some of these other geographic regions. So this first line is the Middle East data, the focus of today's webinar. So about 36% of the respondents do not have green elements. 17% are having plans to get certified in the future. 28% actually have some green elements, but just no certification. And then 20% actually do have buildings that are certified. So when we think about this data here and how we go forward, what we've seen in North America the last 30 years is that the trends have tended to move to the right-hand side here. In other words, more buildings are being certified. However, the last couple of years, we've seen that the trend is now going a little bit more to the left in terms of the number of buildings that are certified. So why is it relevant to us is that I think when you consider adding on different green elements to your facility from a certification standpoint, we have to really understand the value proposition from those elements. So if you spend X number of, money, realities or whatever, to buy something to enhance your facility, but you don't see the net benefit or net gain from that, then that may not be a wise investment, right? So that's really the takeaway here is that as you think about certification, be sure to really evaluate the benefit that your company is going to get from implementing some of those practices. I'm going to have some recommendations here in a moment, but really keep that in mind as you think about that. What this shows here is what types of materials are recycled. Again, this is focused on just the Middle East in terms of different programs. So about half the respondents recycle paper, 38% recycle like computer ink and different things, kitchen oil, light bulbs, batteries. So again, as a benchmarking standpoint, that if you do not do any of these things, this might be one opportunity to consider this further as you look at this. Now, we talked about the energy management practices, and this is really quite interesting, right? So when you look at the Middle East, some of the data is a little bit similar to North America, which again is where our largest data set is coming from. 30% of the respondents in the Middle East implemented some sort of energy management lighting tool. So they replace their lights with LEDs or some other highly efficient lighting technology, right? Equipment controls, 23%, water, 23% of the respondents, all the way down to building envelope. So if you look at this building envelope, what that entails is roofing upgrades or building fabric, so the skin of the building to seal that up better, more efficiently. 5% of the respondents in the Middle East said they did that, whereas 35% of the respondents in North America have taken on those different initiatives. Now, when you think about what actually can make a difference from you from a standpoint, I looked at all the data and I looked at what were the most common practices and then thought about the costs associated with actually implementing some of those practices. So for example, in the Middle East, here are some low cost ideas that can have an impact on the overall operating. And again, these are based on what people commonly responded as good ideas. The first one that has relatively low cost impacts is to adjust the building, the HVAC operating hours. So you decrease the number of hours that the building is cooled, right? Balancing power loads throughout the building, repairing air leaks for like compressed air lines can be another benefit. Again, some of these certainly have costs associated, but the relative value or relative cost to do some of these can be beneficial. Another study that I've seen recently is that if you want to help occupants save energy in your buildings, just teaching them or educating them about, well, turn off the lights when you leave the building, or maybe install sensors that look at the occupants in the space that automatically control the lights. Again, these are things to think about, relatively low cost, but can have big benefits from an energy management standpoint. Other ideas too, smart metering, energy efficient light fixtures, occupant sensors, we talked about that. So again, look at what your peers have done. The report provides some detail about this, and it can certainly be beneficial as we look at this. Now, future trends. Now, this is again based on North America. I don't have a lot of good insight as to what the Middle East is going to look like. Obviously, there's different different political trends and things we need to keep in mind here. But in North America, just in the last 4 years, the amount of electric charging vehicles, solar systems, alternative energy has increased significantly. Now, why is that relevant to us here in the Middle East? This obviously reflects a shifting demographic and in certain parts of the world for demand of certain fuel sources, right? So in North America, again, the demand has increased significantly for some of these other resources over the last few years, and it'll be interesting to track some of this as we look at this over time, right? So again, for you all, just something to think about here is how do we think about what sustainability programs are important for FMs throughout the Middle East? We've talked about several of those. I think the biggest thing to keep in mind here is what can you do that's going to have the biggest impact based on the dollars that you're going to spend inside of your facilities here. So I'm going to move on from this. There's a little bit of a delay between my presentation when you all are actually getting the information here, but I encourage you to continue on LinkedIn to have these conversations, to talk about, what programs have you seen that work really well in terms of, energy management or sustainability, right? Okay, the next part I want to talk about is really some of the nuts and bolts of the operations and maintenance technical side of things. This first slide here shows these are janitorial cost. So this is janitorial or custodial cost. On the left-hand side, this is for the Middle East. So you can see the average cost here. These are presented again in terms of reales. And on the right-hand side, this is for North America. Again, this is just where we have a large data set. So what we're seeing here is that in some cases, the cost for the Middle East for custodial services per square meter is about double what's being reported in North America, right? So there's a couple reasons for this. And again, I encourage you all to add some comments as to why you think, maybe custodial cost is a little bit higher in the Middle East. It could be the level of care that's provided, level of service that's provided. It could be that it's an emerging sector. Maybe the workforce is a little bit different. But again, these are things to think about when you look at the Middle East data, which is very recent, North America, which is a little bit older, but still about the same time frames here, right? So that's what this represents. The other thing we also looked at here is janitorial cost and green certifications. In terms of what we've seen is that a number of different factors can affect what it costs to clean the building. So for example, if you have, what we've seen historically is that if you clean your building after hours, that can have, in this case in the Middle East, a slightly lower cost of cost, right? Because if there's no one in the space, the custodial staff can get in, do what they need to do more efficiently and get out. Maybe there's less cost to do that, right? Other thing that can affect costs, is it done in-house by your own staff, or do you contract that out to other folks here, right? Building ownership, is it owned by the facility or do you lease it out to other spaces? Again, that might affect how we think about things here too. Green certification, recycling programs. Again, all this level, how this affects everything here is based on, what people are doing with that data and how they're going to affect other people with that as well. Now, I see that the chat box here is blowing up here. Again, janitorial, thank you, Carla, refers to cleaning of the building. That's what we're talking about. This data here refers to cleaning the facility itself, right? So it's interesting to look at this. This is really, I think what this is highlighting is the power of benchmarking. Is that as you start developing this data and you compare it to other similar types of facilities, having this data here can help us have a good baseline for what we're looking at. Again, our data set in some regards is a little bit limited, and that's why I encourage us that as we have future benchmarking efforts throughout the Middle East, is to be sure to participate, because that can have a huge impact, right? And I see from Boom Kiet's comment, off-peak janitorial jobs can be a good solution to maintain the facility. Automation can also be adopted, right? So again, really good comments here that there's other innovative ideas that we can think about. And honestly, folks, this is why we like benchmarking, because now we start to see really good ideas and other things we can think about to make some of this easier, faster, more efficient. The other part of this report looks at maintenance cost. Now, maintenance cost refers to the, well, I guess as the name supplies, right, suggests, is maintaining the building. The way we have provided this maintenance data, these maintenance costs, is by 6 main categories. There's the external building, so like the fabric of the building on the outside. There's interior systems, so carpet, walls, ceilings, things like that, the inside of the building. We also looked at roads and grounds. We looked at utility or central systems, process treatment, and the overall total cost to do that. Now, we actually have pretty good data as we look at this here, right? So for example, we're seeing that the average cost per square meter for external building maintenance is about 100 reales per square meter, right? For interior systems, we're looking at about 227 reales per square meter. And we also have additional data in the report about these other areas as well, right? So again, when we think about this, is that if I'm trying to understand how efficient I run my building or how I manage my building, these benchmarks provide us a good way to understand, compared to other people from a maintenance standpoint, what are we seeing here? This next slide, I think is, it's really quite interesting. What this shows here is we asked FMs, again, how do you maintain or track the maintenance programs inside of your facility? We have asked this question in North America for the last probably 20 to 30 years. We've continued to ask it in Asia and Europe and now the Middle East, and you can see the data here. What's interesting is that the prevalence of there are a number of like automated or digital tracking management systems which work pretty well, but what we've seen is that the adoption of those systems hasn't really taken off. So for example, in North America, what we see is that about 30% of the respondents use some sort of CMMS system, right? 14% use CAFM. But look at this, 37% of the respondents use spreadsheets or Excel, right? Now that's gone down slightly, but just 3 or 4 years ago, this was at almost like 40 or 50%, right? So a lot of people prefer to do things by Excel, right? So it's just interesting to look at how these trends have changed over time to see what's going on. In Asia, again, this is a different geographic region. 22% of the people prefer to do it by, when I say manual, what this means is actually on a sheet of paper. I have talked to FMs before that they track their maintenance programs. Literally, they have a sheet of paper and they write down, they track everything. Now, again, that's one way to approach it, but I think there's opportunities here. Some simple digital tools, whether it's Excel or other systems out there, can make this go a little bit easier, right? So 22% do it by hand. 39% use Excel. So more than half the respondents in Asia don't really use a digital online tracking system. Now, what am I saying here? I'm not trying to be, don't adopt any of these technologies here. I'm just saying that a lot of FMs, here's the Middle East data, 15% use hard copies, 33% use Excel, right? So again, if you are in the space of trying to get more technology out there from a different standpoint of tracking CMMS or CAFM, again, a lot of people haven't really adopted that, but it's again something that we'll continue watching and to see how things change over time. Okay. This next this next slide is about staffing, right? One of the most common questions I think IFMA gets is how many people do I need to hire for a given position, right? So what the report also provides actually extremely detailed data about the staffing breakdown. So for example, we provide staffing data. When I mean staffing, what I mean is the number of people performing a certain job function. So for example, we have carpenters, we have controls and low voltage staff, we have electricians, generalists, HVAC, and locksmiths, right? And we also have mechanics, masons, fabric technicians, painters, management staff, administrative. So we provide a bunch of detail about different staff requirements. We have the average number of people performing these job functions. So on average, the facility has 5.4 carpenters for their facility. Now that is a somewhat useful metric, but it obviously depends on the size of the facility. So what we have here is the number of the number of square meters that are managed per FTE. So in this case here, that if you have your staff, you can count out the number of carpenters you have in your facility and divide that number by the size of your facility. So take the total size of your facility, divide it by the number of carpenters, and that would tell you on average how many square feet that they're responsible for managing. The benchmark is at 20,000 square meters, right? So if your facility is much higher, let's say you take your total facility, divide it by your carpenters, and you come out with, let's say, 50,000 square meters. What that means here is that your staff is smaller in that the individual people are responsible for managing a much larger area, right? So and the report provides details and examples as to how to calculate this, but this can be a really good metric to see, well, what does my staffing look like compared to everybody else? And if you find yourself in a situation where you don't have enough people, in other words, your benchmarks are much higher, then maybe this is one way we can come in and provide some additional resources to make the case that we need to do more people. The report also provides detail about what percentage on average are these carpenters in-house employed by the actual organization versus what percentage of them are contracted out. So for example, for carpenters, 45% of them are in-house and 55% of them are contracted out. We also look at the number of shifts per day. So there's on average about 2.1 shifts per day, and they work an average of 5 days per week. So that's a lot of detail, folks. Again, the report has much more detail about this, but staffing is a huge thing to think about. In fact, that's another question for maybe for some comments here, folks, is to jump in here about, I mean, finding people, at least here in my local geographic region here in the U.S., finding people to provide some of these technical trades is really, really difficult, right? So keep that in mind here is that how do you personally deal with the staffing, right? Have you seen staffing shortages in your own geographic region, right? I mean, I encourage you to have have a conversation here online about how have you dealt with finding quality people. Sometimes the question is, well, we just come in here and we filled in with whoever might be a good fit. Is a warm body, if you will, right? Just finding somebody to sit in the seat. But there's other people I've worked with that it's not just about hiring people for the sake of hiring people. It's about finding the right people in the right position at the right time. And there's a whole other set of tools here to think about that can make this easier, but it certainly does provide some of that data. Now, I see a question here from Biju. The question is, does the report cover the number specific to educational facilities? So the answer is yes. So for example, when we get to jump back here for a moment, one of the questions was, let me find this here, for the janitorial cost. So in this case here, I provide data about the average cleaning cost, right? So I have just the overall numbers, but we do provide some detail about educational facilities, right? For the maintenance costs, we have the overall numbers. We provide other benchmarks to provide that data, but the answer to the question is that yes, we do provide some details about the educational facilities, right? So if you have other questions, be sure to jump in here. But again, the main takeaway here is that finding people is really challenging, and it's something that is going to be a challenge for a number of years. So keep that in mind as we think about this. So in conclusion, here's some final key considerations or final thoughts about this. Firstly, if you have never benchmarked before, that's okay. Start small, right? If you have no idea how to get access to this data, I would choose something that's relatively straightforward and easy for you to collect the data on. Typically, one of those areas might be cleaning cost or janitorial, right? Look at the average cost you spent for the last 12 months here and divide that by the number of the total size of your facility, right? Start small, do what you can today. Don't get lost in trying to do everything all at once because you'll never get it done. Choose something simple and easy and make that your starting point for a benchmark. The other thing I encourage you to think about as you start collecting this data is to go from good, better, and then best. Good means you collect data about something, anything inside your facility. That's good. Better is to take that data and focus on areas that can help you actually make a key change in how you operate your facility, right? So cost per square meter, number of people, right? These are things that you can look at and hopefully make some changes or decisions based on what that data is. The best is to take all that data you've collected, but then do it on an annual basis. Every year, every 6 months is the best way to do this is collect that benchmark data and track it over time. Because once you start tracking over time, this helps you predict and understand what's going to happen in the future. You can actually develop better forecasting models in terms of how your facility is operating. That's the best. And this benchmark data can provide some key ways to help understand what's actually going on with this data. The third thing here is that effective benchmarking leads to effective business cases. So if you're trying to allocate for, we need more funding for a certain area, having a good benchmark and a good business case to go with it can actually make that happen. Having the data to support what you're asking for is really important. And without that data, it just becomes hard to believe that what we're asking for is actually reasonable, right? So what does a good business case look like? It shows here's the benefit to us as an organization, here's what my peers have done, and here's how this is going to save us money. What I have found professionally is that those are the three key things that really make an effective business case. FM finally needs to become a data-driven function. Well, what in the world does that mean? My recommendation and where I see the future of facilities going is that we make a lot of our decisions in terms of how we operate our building, how we hire people to work for us, how we decide how we're going to maintain the cleaner, the maintenance aspect of our facilities is based on the data, right? Based on the data. Now, that means we're not going to do that for everything here, but as a function, as in terms of understanding what our peers are doing, what our own facility is doing, having that data can help us have better insights, more effective insights, and really understanding what's going on. So again, for the future, key considerations, things to think about as we go forward here. So that brings us to the conclusion of our presentation today. If you have any questions or comments now, would be a great time to jump in here. If you want a copy of these slides, be sure to drop me an email, jake.smithwick@uncc.edu. I see one of the questions here is how do we get a copy of the benchmarking report? The report is currently going through graphic editing, and that'll be ready probably in the next 2 or 3 weeks. IFMA will be sending out an email, a marketing campaign to tell everybody about the presentation. Everybody's also on the report on the meeting today. We'll also get a note about that. You can also drop me an email, jake.smithwick@uncc, and I will be sure to send you a copy of the presentation today for that as well. Okay, folks, what other questions do we have about that, right? We do have some other upcoming studies too. This is actually quite exciting. We do have the 12 cities operation and maintenance study. Now, if we can drop off the slides here for a moment, what IFMA is doing, and we've just embarked on this, is that we are benchmarking the 12 largest global cities throughout the world, right? So we're going to basically touch all corners of the earth in terms of the largest cities, right? So be on the lookout for that. That city is currently coming. One of those cities is actually Cairo. So we're going to be benchmarking facilities throughout Cairo. If you find yourself in that region or you know somebody that is in that region, please, please, please reach out to us. We are very interested in talking with you about how you manage your facility and collecting some data about that. Our goal here is to publish a report that has all the data about, from a global standpoint, what can we expect in a certain geographic regions throughout the world from a operations and a maintenance benchmarking standpoint. Okay, what other questions do we have here? Let me check the chat box here. So you can see I got some comments. So one of the questions here about the janitorial costing, let me go through that. So Sumith, the question was about janitorial costing. Is that cost per square foot or per square meter? So let me bring that up here and I will answer that question. Here we go. So the cost provided for this isn't cost per square meter. So these are reales per square meter on the left-hand side. This is the Middle East. This is in the report. This is North America. Obviously, that's presented in cost U.S. dollars per square foot, but I do provided the converted values, 87 reales per square foot. Again, this is for North America. So to answer your question, Sumith, is that it was cost per square meter. That's what this is. Next question is, how will IT and the facilities world work together? Ooh. Edino, that's a really good question. Thank you for that. In fact, we are embarking on some studies right now. In fact, we have another report that is coming out here probably the next week or so, is the IFMA technology report. It's really focused on how do you procure and buy technology. One of the main things we're seeing in this report, and I think this answers your question, is that in the future, a lot of people are predicting that facilities and IT will be almost one and the same, right? Well, that's pretty extreme, right? But think about it. Some people are suggesting is that in the facilities department, we're going to see like specialty positions, like a facilities IT director, right? I've not seen that before. A facilities information technology director is a new position that a lot of people predict that's going to be coming down the line here. So how do we work together? I think it's going to be continued a more integrated environment where as we have our systems that are connected to the cloud, as we look at the different technologies they provide and connecting that to the IT infrastructure of our organizations. So I think that's going to continue. And as we enhance those partnerships, the data that we now have access to as a facility professional will also continue going up. So I'd love to chat with you more about that. Be sure to check out our upcoming technology report that will be published here soon. In fact, I think we have a webinar coming up in a few weeks that'll be about that technology report. So be sure to check that out and provide some additional insights and details on that as well. All right. Any other questions or comments? I'm going to pop on my email just here one more time. If you do have any questions or comments, please be sure to send out an email, jake.smithwick@uncc.edu. You can also contact IFMA, Nicholas Rocha, or you can reach out to the social media pages for IFMA, and we'll certainly be glad to connect with them. Any other questions or comments here? Give it about 10 more seconds, and then we'll wrap it up. All right. Well, folks, thank you so much for your time today. I'm going to turn the time back over to Nick. Nick, thanks for having me.
Thank you, Jake. Much appreciated. Thank you for everybody attending today. If you have any other additional questions, you can reach out to Jake or myself, and we'll be glad to report back. Much appreciated, everybody. Have a great time. Bye.
Take care. Bye.